You are listening to Fantha Tracks.
Because of the following special program, Wonder Woman and the Incredible Hulk will not be presented this evening.
It's time to get all your Star Wars news in a single file. This is Making Tracks. Here are your hosts, Mark Newbold and Mark Mulcaster.
That's not true. That's impossible.
You're listening to episode 71 of Making Tracks. I'm your co-host Mark Newbold, and joining me today is a man who, if he ripped the ears off a gundark, he'd know how to put them back on. Mark, Happy New Year.
With Velcro. That's the only way you can do it.
Is that it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very well, my friend. How are you? Happy New Year. How was your New Year's?
It was good, considering this is like the least normal New Year we've probably ever had. We went down a different path for New Year. We thought we want to do something. There was not a huge amount on the telly, and we were on our own. We usually spend it down in Bournemouth with friends. So it was just me and Ruth. So we got some party food in. I did a nice steak dinner. We had a chilled out on the sofa with a blanket, watched a bit of telly, and we decided that at 9:29 and 30 seconds, we would hit play on Avengers Endgame on Disney Plus, which meant that exactly, and I couldn't believe how bang on it was, exactly at the stroke of midnight, Tony Stark snaps his fingers, does the snap, and says, "I'm Iron Man," and Thanos is defeated. So it was a really good way to kick off the new year. So
cool.
that was New Year for us. What about you?
Similarly, we kind of just brought in way too much party food. But I tell you what, it's a great way to make you want to kickstart the diet the next day. We just did a call with our next door neighbours on Zoom, and I think we did like Kahoot quizzes for about 4 hours, like something ridiculous like that. We've done the whole Black Death Star thing before, and I kind of said, well, can't we just have it on in the background? But then Skyfall was on TV, so I was just like, well, I'll tell you what, I'll keep Skyfall on, and I'll keep an eye on that and own everybody at the quizzes as well. So yeah, so my biggest revelation from this holiday season is that I know a lot more about Harry Potter than I actually realised, because I've out-owned everybody at all the Harry Potter quizzes that I've done, which is bizarre. Didn't do any Star Wars ones because I thought that's probably a bit unfair, because I'm a bit handicapped when it comes to Star Wars. So
I did take part in a Star Wars quiz over the last few days.
Oh yes.
Which I was rather surprised to find that I won, because I didn't expect to win. It was Dave Tree's quiz. It was the quiz that should have been done at Empire 40 that technical issues meant never happened. So Dave ran it for New Year. I honestly said if I get more than 10, I'll be happy.
I saw that because I was in and out. I kind of dropped in and out, but I was kind of preoccupied with other stuff. But I answered a few questions, and then it started getting a little bit tough, and I was like, yes, I'm going.
Well, it was fun. I mean, I got 24 out of 30.
Yeah.
The last question was annoying because I knew, if you asked me any other day, I'd go, yeah, Empire won 2 Oscars. And I put 3 for some reason, because everything was numbered 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes.
And so instead of looking at the 3 for the amount of awards, I looked at the 3 as the answer.
Oh, yeah.
Does that make sense? So I was reading the wrong number, so I was very lucky. And who knows? It's all good fun. It was great fun. I've had a happy New Year and a nice Christmas, and now it's 2021. And the Star Wars year hasn't really got going yet, but we've managed to dredge some news and some stuff that we could talk about. Darth Vader, in a Radio Times poll, has been voted the most popular villain with 33%. With a whole slew of really interesting characters sitting behind him. First things first, not a big surprise that Vader won, is it?
No, not really. But okay, so let's just clarify this. This was a Radio Times poll with the number 1 Star Wars villain, isn't it? It's not just general villains, because I know that Darth Vader has, he's topped a few of those in the past. In fact, I think most of them. But yeah, so this one, yes, this is just a pure Star Wars one, and he comes higher than his boss, doesn't he? He comes higher than the Emperor, who only got 18%.
Yeah. It's a good list, and it's a good mix as well.
Yeah.
Vader tops it, as you say. Good old Sheev comes in at second, and then everybody else is within a few percent of each other. Vader and the Emperor are miles ahead of everybody else. Coming in third was Grand Admiral Thrawn, of course, gets a name check in The Mandalorian. We've just had him come back. He came back in Rebels. He's in and around it. His books are coming out again. So he's a character that's kind of in people's minds. And there was a few on 6%. There was Thrawn. There was Darth Maul, a few votes behind in fourth. And then Boba Fett, who I expect and always expect to be higher up. But do you think, now that we've seen those episodes of Mandalorian, and Fett is now more of a cool heel. He's not necessarily a villain anymore, is he? He's had a bit of a change.
Well, that's what we talked about when those episodes came out with Mandalorian, is that actually, it feels like they spent a lot of time trying to put Boba Fett over, to carry on using wrestling terms. Because they say Star Wars fans, so obviously, how do you qualify a Star Wars fan? Is that people who just like Star Wars, or is that people like you and I and, most of the people who listen to this podcast? So there's different tiers, and that's probably why we've got such an interesting mix, with Grand Admiral Thrawn being in third place. I probably would have put him lower down and would have put Darth Maul probably after Darth Vader. I don't know about Emperor. It's the question is like, how are we classifying a villain? What makes a good villain? Is it somebody who's meant to be scary, or is it just somebody who's kind of like very evil and and is pulling the strings? Because if that's the case, then the Emperor really should be number one, because like the whole Skywalker saga is pretty much based around stuff that he's been meddling around with in the background.
And you make a good point about what sort of encapsulates what a villain is, because at number 7 on 4%, 399 votes, was Greedo. And I never saw Greedo as a villain. I mean, I saw him as an opportunist, like a Toro Calican style opportunist. But, I never saw him particularly as a villain. He was just wrong place, wrong time, picked on the wrong guy at the wrong moment, and definitely didn't shoot first. I'm not buying that. So he got 4%, just a few votes ahead of Moff Gideon, so that's showing a strong showing for the Mandalorian as well.
Yeah, that's really kind of interesting. And actually, Moff Gideon, I think, was one of the standout characters from season 2. I didn't quite buy his character in season 1, but the more we kind of saw him on the bridge and stuff during season 2, the whole kind of like mustache twirling, kind of cape wearing kind of villain, I guess, for lack of a better term, it all kind of started to kind of click together. I mean, it's interesting when you go down it, because you've got like the Grand Inquisitor, from Rebels. Yeah. Sarge Ventress. And again, I suppose it also depends upon where you see them in the overall galaxy and stuff, because kind of really by the end of her life, Sarge Ventress again is kind of like, she's quite a likeable character. Even at the season 5 or something like that of Clone Wars, she's kind of starts to be a little bit more likeable when she starts kind of like working a little bit with Ahsoka. She's an interesting character. I mean, she's definitely one of those characters that I would love to see in some form of live action TV. There's a lot about her that I think would make really compelling storytelling.
Agreed. And I'm looking at this list, and it's weird in that I've just mentioned Greedo. He's the only character there who really just has a vignette, because Vader's in everything, so's the Emperor. Thrawn's been in plenty of stuff, so has Maul. Fett is back with his own series. Grievous was only Kane Revenge of the Sith, but of course he was in the Clone Wars, and he was in the Tartakovsky Clone Wars miniseries, micro series as well. Moff Gideon's been in 2 seasons. Amanda Kylo Ren was in the sequel trilogy. Tarkin was in A New Hope and Rogue One. Dooku was in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith and the Clone Wars. Snoke was in Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, and also kind of bobbling around in a bottle in The Rise of Skywalker. Phasma was in the first 2 of the sequel trilogy films and has been in other shorts. Asajj Ventress, of course, was in the Clone Wars, both animated Clone Wars series. The Inquisitor was the villain in 1 season of Rebels, but he was in the whole season. And Jabba the Hutt, of course, was in Jedi and New Hope Special Edition, and we've seen him in other stuff. But Greedo is 1 scene.
Yeah, no, 1 scene. And also, I think, even in the old expanded universe, I think there's always a bit of sympathy for Greedo. He definitely bit off more than he could chew, I think, when he tried to take on Han. So, it's an interesting kind of, like, position for Greedo. But, hey, that's not bad. He's done pretty well out of that list.
He certainly has. I think if I had to pick out an impact player from that list, weirdly enough, it's the one guy who I don't think should be on there, because I don't see him as a villain. I see him as an opportunist, and that would be Greedo. But good news, and also kind of bittersweet, within a few weeks of Dave Prowse passing away, Darth Vader cements his position as the number 1 Star Wars villain. So I thought it was an interesting list. And again, like you said, it's always good to see Vader in a general movie villains list, because it's usually him, Hannibal Lecter, Freddy Krueger. It's those kind of guys, and Vader's generally pretty high up there, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. And I think what's interesting about Vader is that actually I've never found him scary. I've never found him at all scary, but then some kids really do. And I mean, I see this when I go to events, when I'm costuming with a 501st or Rebel Legion. There's always at least one child at any event that you attend that will be absolutely petrified of Darth Vader. And I suppose that's the thing, when he's on screen, he's not quite as imposing as when you're stood in front of somebody who's kind of like 6'6", 6'7". I guess it's the whole kind of demeanor, and especially in A New Hope, he has got this kind of like this more kind of henchman kind of like mystique about him, but actually kind of gets eroded through Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. It's also interesting to kind of like, it'd be great to take people who've just seen Star Wars in 1977 and then pull them out of time and then kind of say, if this is like Darth Vader's story now, and see how like their perception changes, because especially with like stuff like the Marvel comic series, which has done a really good job of expanding that pre and New Hope Vader, and kind of made him both merciless but also quite sympathetic, because he's so broken on so many different levels that actually it's a character that I don't think anybody would imagine would have the depth and the scope that he now has 44 years ago.
In A New Hope, he is the enforcer, isn't he? He's the bruiser. He's Diesel to HBK's Heartbreak Kid, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's the muscle. So Tarkin comes in, and then here comes this great big 7-foot-tall leather thing behind him. And as you say, as the story evolves, and obviously as Lucas delved deeper into the relationships and pulls out all these extra things and puts definition on different stuff. Yeah, if you looked at Vader in 77 and then looked at where he is now, it's clear, obviously, we know, we've followed his journey, it's the same guy, as is the little blonde kid on Tatooine in Phantom Menace, which I always appreciate. You're seeing him go from somewhere, point A to point hell, which is where he ends up at the end of Sith, and then we follow it through. Do you think it has ever diminished Vader as a character, that he has gone from just being a template, skeletal, Doctor Doom, bad guy? We were just talking before we started recording about Cobra Kai, about John Kreese.
I was just thinking
and
about
they've given Kreese that backstory of, up until now, he's just been an absolute arsehole. He's just been the bad guy, and you've needed no light or shade. He's just the dark side, isn't he?
Yeah.
And now you're learning through season 3, without spoiling too much, that they delve into his character. I won't say how, but they delve into his character, and you learn that there's actually a bit of reasoning why he's so, how he is.
Yeah.
And they're giving a bit of light and shade to the character. Do you think that's ever hurt Vader as a character by giving him the backstory of Anakin and young Anakin and his love for Padme and all the other stuff, that his servitude to Palpatine and everything else? Do you think it's ever hurt Vader as a villain?
Oh, that's an interesting twist to his conversation. I don't think so. I think everybody was pretty curious as to see how he ended up going from being a Jedi Knight to the man that we see, the more machine, the man, and twisted and evil. I think there is always that risk, especially as we're now into this territory whereby we're in comics and cartoons and spin-off series and Disney Plus stuff and everything else, that there's always a potential that they could dilute that, and it's only going to take one story decision that's going to suddenly throw everything off kilter a little bit. I mean, I kind of like what they've done in a lot of the Marvel comics, whereby they've kind of made Vader have to prove himself to the Emperor. Yes. And kind of get used to the suit. And he seems to be constantly having to do that and constantly having to wrestle with stuff. I mean, the stuff with Padme is interesting. To a degree, I quite like it. But at the same time, there's a lot going on behind that mask. And I think there's things that they can still do with Vader. I think they haven't quite nailed down how cunning he is when it comes to like planning stuff and manipulating people in the Empire, which I think he seems to, the hints of being a mastermind at. I think we could get that more with like people like Krennic now in the mix, and how does Krennic and Vader, who've again coming from two different aspects, how they going to kind of meet and how they're going to clash and stuff, which we might even see in the Andor series, for instance. I think there's a lot they can do with Vader, but you've got to be careful that you don't kind of erode that core kind of sensibility of what he is in those original trilogy films. You've got to tread with caution, which I think now like Lucasfilm and a lot of the writers are kind of like they're getting their heads around actually that kind of stuff.
I think it's a risk as well for Boba Fett, isn't it?
Yeah.
It feels like that storyline is going to move forward in the timeline because, and it goes back to Han and Greedo. I say it flippantly, but for me, to take Han as a character who will coldly shoot Greedo as a threat right in front of him with a blaster in his face, to giving the keys to the Falcon to Lando, is a story arc that you watch evolve throughout those 3 films. And it's subtle. He's still Han Solo from top to bottom, but there's a subtle change in his attitudes that's really hinted. Well, it's not even hinted, it's thrown in your face in A New Hope, because he comes back and helps Luke, take out the TIE fighter so he can blow up the Death Star. But you see the development. He actually gives a crap and he cares, and you see that develop. And with Boba Fett, what worries me is that they go back into the history of Boba Fett to time periods we're familiar with, pre-Sarlacc, and they suddenly start showing Fett as either overtly a man of honor or a guy who will, like Mando style, turn up to a small town and help the locals defeat the bad guys. And that, to me, was never Fett's MO.
No.
When he was full on classic Fett, if you like. It's all about the money, all about, opportunity, all about reputation, all about getting in and out as quick as he can, leave the mess behind. He never struck me as a guy that was bothered about any of that because he was completely a man on a mission. Now, post-Sarlacc, you can show the regret for that lifetime, the reparations he might want to make. You've got something to atone for. And if they go back and retcon him and make him sympathetic in that pre-Sarlacc era, if you want to make that a dividing line, I think it defangs what you could show. Now we've got Book of Boba Fett coming up as an ongoing thing, So I think they've got some fantastic story opportunities there.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because let's be honest, Boba Fett in the Clone Wars wasn't right little git, wasn't he? He was a right little arsehole.
Totally.
He was like, admittedly, he was a teenager, so you can understand a lot of that. But I wonder if the line, I'm just a simple man just trying to make his way in the galaxy, that we heard by his father, and then he uses again in The Mandalorian. I wonder if that's kind of where they're headed, where actually they start to move away from that kind of like hard-ass mercenary into somebody who is just trying to get by. It'll be interesting to see how he develops and what his MO is for the Book of Boba Fett, because he's on the throne now. So is he going to be a fair ruler? Is he going to actually be kind of more like probably Jabba the Hutt, who's toying with people for amusement, or just completely just cruel as anything? It'll be interesting to see that whole series and see what they're going to do with that. And like you say, how much backstory we get, be it from before the Sarlacc or even from the Sarlacc to that point.
Yeah, I mean, looking at that list of villains as well, you think Marvel, you mentioned Marvel completely correctly, because even back in the Dark Horse days, they were delving into his past, his post-Revenge of the Sith past really neatly there. And now Marvel have picked it up with now what we're on the third run of Darth Vader series now, aren't we?
Yeah, I think
version
so.
1 in 2015. We had a second one with Charles Soule, and now we're on a third one with Greg Pak. That's been fascinating to read. But like you say, it adds all that depth to it. So in a weird way, I think a Vader TV series with him as a lead character wouldn't work. I don't think that would add anything or give you anything, because by nature, TV will just feel like they've got to make him a good guy sometimes, and that's not Vader. You always want people to blanch a little bit when he walks in the room. The only person in the whole of Star Wars who shouldn't stiffen up and, when he walks in the room is Palpatine, to me anyway. Or somebody who thinks he's his equal and very quickly finds out that he's not. That's Vader for me, which is why you mentioned it earlier. You've got opportunities in Andor. We're getting Hayden back as Vader in Obi-Wan. There's opportunities to pepper that classic character in to a lot of these series quite smartly. And I can't think of anybody else on that list particularly that I'd want to see head up a series in the same way that I think Fett's got a broad canvas of stories to tell and something to almost make up for.
This is Steve Bloom, voice of Zebralios, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks. Caravast. May the force be with you.
Daisy Ridley has encountered a troublesome situation on set. She was apparently told by a crew member whilst working on Chaos Walking with Tom Holland that she was intimidating, and a director told her that her energy is quite aggressive. So this has obviously knocked her back on her heels a little bit, because reading the article, she seems to be almost looking at herself and second-guessing what other people may think of her. What do you make of this? Daisy's been around Star Wars now for a good few years. We're all familiar with her. Force Awakens came out 5 years ago, so she's been in our sort of sphere of Star Wars for a long time now. She is intense. She's one of those people that look you in the eyes when you're talking to her. She's serious about her craft. Do you think it's fair that she has to sort of look at herself through other people's opinions and go, wow, am I coming over like that? And start second guessing herself? Seems a bit unfair to me.
Yeah, it does a little bit. I mean, it's tough, isn't it? Because somebody being told that they're intimidating is obviously based on somebody else's opinion. But that could just be because maybe she's not necessarily intimidating, but maybe, she's just, for lack of a better term, she stands up for herself, or that maybe she asks questions back. There's times when you think, well, women in the film industry have always had this kind of issue whereby they do tend to, they're seen as troublemakers if they stand up and they question or they push back too hard. The industry's changing, and we're seeing this more and more and more about female actors are being able to be more vocal and define the roles that they want to define, both in production but also on screen. This could be something about a cast or crew member said kind of like offhand and maybe taken slightly out of context, or it could just be probably a symptom of like the older era of filmmaking that still needs to kind of get on board with attitudes of like the 21st century.
If this was a Christian Bale or a Tom Hardy or somebody or some big muscled up bruiser who's played some action hero roles, and he was a straight talker and he was very direct and he was a look you in the eye kind of person, I don't think anybody would even consider saying something like this. But because it's a female actor or actress who's quite full on and direct and enthusiastic and passionate about what she's doing, it just came across as kind of unfair that she's even had to consider this. That she's had to sort of sit back and go, is that how I come across? Because, I mean, if you read the piece, I've been called aggressive too. My energy is quite aggressive. That was during a meeting with the director. I was thinking, but why? Is it because I maintain eye contact? Is it because I'm passionate about what we're talking about? I don't know. You have that horrible sinking feeling of, God, do I not come across the way I think I do? To say that and to feel like that and to have to verbalise that in an interview just seems off to me.
Yes, it's sad, isn't it? I mean, let's be fair, there's times in the sequel trilogy where you can see how intense Daisy Ridley can be as an actor. And that's normally because they take their role seriously, they take their craft seriously, and that's something that should be commended. It's like, sometimes the more veteran actors can get away with stuff because they've either got a reputation or they've, it's how they've always done it and stuff, like when you start like method acting and, you kind of plunge yourself into that character and there's certain, famous A-listers who kind of do that and then, but that's just accepted. And I think sometimes because maybe Daisy, whilst she's famous and a big name to us because of Star Wars, she's still relatively young in her career. So maybe, again, there's that whole kind of notion of actually there's people who think she hasn't necessarily kind of got the clout to be able to act the way she does, when actually she probably does. Yeah. As long as she's being courteous on set, as long as she's not doing like a Tom Cruise and swearing and blinding and shouting and screaming at like cast members, there's absolutely no reason why, she can't have that energy and that focus and drive, and maybe it's not necessarily that Daisy needs to look at herself, but maybe it's the actual production needs to look at themselves and base their opinions on their own kind of like insecurities rather than hers. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good analogy, the Tom Cruise thing. He's 30 plus year veteran, pushing 40 years really, if you go back to the early 80s, his earlier films. And so yes, of course, with the hits he's had, the money he's drawn in, he's got insane clout. Never enough clout for me to justify the way he kicked off at people in that recording. No. I would have walked out the room. I wouldn't have stood for that. But nevertheless, you've got to give him the respect that's due because of his longevity in the industry. Mm-hmm. And as you say, what's Daisy done outside of Star Wars? She's done the 3 Star Wars movies. She did Murder on the Orient Express, some voiceover work in a couple of animated films. And, she's set for a great career. I think music's going to come into her career more because she's got a great voice. So, she's well set. But nevertheless, I can only imagine a director, and you're closer to the industry than I am, but I can only imagine a director would want somebody who comes on set who's passionate and up for it and interested and wants to know and is a bit intense. And other than some actors who just bobble onto set and just say the lines and just bimble off. And some actors can turn it on in a heartbeat and don't need to get into it. That's the same with any industry, isn't it? But I just thought it was a shame that she even had to say this.
Hey man, it's me, Kevin Smith, a Star Wars fan, Fantha Tracks fan.
So I think it's fair to say that the climax of Season 2 of The Mandalorian gave us an early Christmas gift in the form of a lightsaber twirling, Death Trooper butt-kicking Luke Skywalker that many were hoping we would have seen in the sequel trilogy. Mark Hamill wrote a lovely tweet the other day in which he thanked show creators Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau. He said, "Sometimes the greatest gifts are the most unexpected and something you never realised you wanted until it was given." So what do you make of this, Mark? Is that him thanking Dave and Jon for his role in The Mandalorian, or is that Mark thanking the producers on behalf of the fans?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I mean, he will have seen and followed all the online reaction. He's very social media active and quite savvy. I think Chelsea, his daughter's involved in his social media team. So I think they see and look at a lot of stuff and would have picked up on the almost universally positive reaction to it. The fact that they brought Luke into it and really Season 2 just proper went for it, because I don't think any of us, we've said this on the show, I don't think any of us expected the amount of appearances from characters like Fett, Ahsoka, Bo-Katan, Luke Skywalker, R2-D2. all these characters turning up in season 2. Nobody anticipated that. Outside of the people who were looking for the inside skinny on stuff, spoilers and such, who probably had a decent idea that a lot of this was coming. The sequel trilogy is 30 years on from Return of the Jedi. So, we're still a quarter of a century before The Force Awakens at this point. So when Hamill came into The Force Awakens, he knew that this Luke that we saw in Mandalorian was not an option. I don't think the Luke that we saw in the second and third films was probably what he expected. I know he thought he'd be in Force Awakens more, but like Anthony Daniel said, the whole film's a teaser for you turning up at the end. Just think of it that way. And it is one of the great cinema reveals at the end of Force Awakens. And Hamill has said himself, the way Luke is portrayed in The Last Jedi isn't how he would have done it. But nevertheless, a lot of people online have picked up on some of the things that Mandalorian era Luke does that kind of feeds into the Luke situation in The Last Jedi. It's classic Star Wars, isn't it? It's filling in the gaps and connective tissue and all that story stuff. If you can make the dots join up, then it all works. But I think really this is just in its isolation, Hamill saying, I didn't expect it to look like that. I didn't expect me, as a guy who's pushing 70, to be on screen looking like I did in 1982 when I filmed it, getting a scene like that, because he was on set, and I still say, we talked about Disney Gallery, the one glaring omission. We get why, we discussed that, we get why, because of security and such. But I still feel like that's something I want to see at some juncture. I really want to see him on that set. I want to see Pedro Pascal and the other actors acting opposite Hamill. Ming-Na Wen put a tweet out, didn't she, saying, it was one of the great highlights of my life, not my career, my life, to be in a scene with you. What we see on screen, very easily, there was you mentioned the fella's name, the double that did all the fight stuff. Clearly, the more somber, solemn speaking scenes with Luke, I want to see it. But yeah, he's buzzing. And he does say later that, this was filmed over a year ago, probably not that long after he'd finished his work on Rise of Skywalker. Your news feeds, your Facebook news feeds probably look very similar to mine. There was people who basically just outright just kind of came out and said this was like the best thing that they've seen since Return of the Jedi. And, whether or not you agree with it or not, they felt that in some way the wrongs that had been committed through the sequel trilogy were somehow righted by this one scene. What I took from it and what I quite liked was that it kind of felt to me like a very parallel kind of scene to that of Darth Vader in Rogue One. It was kind of like that wish fulfillment kind of thing about it, where it's like, this is the Luke Skywalker you've always wanted to see. And you're totally right. I don't think we could probably have had Mark Hamill do that in the sequel trilogy, not necessarily from an age perspective, but again, you kind of think, well, Luke would have been, 28 at that time? And so he probably is still quite heavily in the midst of kind of like using violence and his lightsaber to win every battle, when you kind of think as a Jedi gets older, probably the need and the desire to actually pick up a lightsaber gets reduced because they find other alternatives to get through their, the troublesome areas. I think it's great. And actually, this isn't the only tweet that Mark's put out recently, is it? That Toshi Station power station thing, that was just amazing. It looked to me like they took Luke's or Hamill's head and stuck it on top of Del Boy. It just had that vibe about it, which I just thought was hilarious. No, that was whoever came up with that one was a bit of a genius, and playing it out the way they did. But just to go briefly back to Luke in The Rescue, if Luke had been mowing down living people, stormtroopers, playing the old West End games, that's a dark side point, mowing through people like that. A bit like Ahsoka did in the Jedi episode, her episode, when she was slicing through people. Yeah, to me, I was totally waiting for her to be some dark side aspect to it. I know that she was, they were shooting at her and such, and she's not a Jedi. That's worth pointing out. She walked away. So she's not, she can use a lightsaber, she uses the Force, but she's not a Jedi anymore. So, or as far as we understand anyway, she's got knowledge and connections and such. At this point, I don't think that's her game. But nevertheless, Luke is taken out very dangerous. These are super battle droids. Yeah. As much as he needs to neutralise them in the moment to get to the bridge, also I would imagine there's an element of, I don't want these things getting out and attacking other people. These could cause real damage. Yeah. They've got no conscience. They don't care. So to nullify them and take them out, and they are completely mechanical as well. Moff Gideon says that. So I think there's an element of, you could look at that in more than one aspect. The nearest we ever got to Luke being this badass was Return of the Jedi on the skiff, on the sailboats, that whole sequence. That's the nearest we got, because obviously going up against Vader and the Emperor, it's kill or be killed, essentially, until he throws the weapon away and just tries to think of another way. But I ain't doing this anymore. This ain't working. He's even more. You look at Luke in Star Wars and Empire, he's still the farm boy, isn't he? Still the buzzed, full of energy. That was Luke. And then you get to Jedi and it's hood up, much more somber, much more measured, thinking about what he says and how he says it. He's not the emotional kid anymore. He's been trained, not much, but he's been trained.
For everything in one location, daily news, reviews, interviews, podcasts, video and social media feeds, bookmark fanthatracks.com for Star Wars news 24/7, 365.
Who do you think would win in a fight between Revenge of the Sith Anakin and Luke at the end of The Rescue? And my answer to the question was I think Anakin would win, because Anakin's been a Padawan, he's been a master, he's had all that training, he's got all the knowledge, and he's the chosen one, and he's got all the physical attributes to make it work. Whereas Luke only ever trained under Ben very briefly, and Yoda, again, not for anywhere near as long as a Padawan should, and he was a teenage, he was in his 20s by the time he got to Yoda. What do you think? Do you think he would have had a chance?
I think you're right. I think Anakin will probably have him, and I think it will come down to probably the use of the dark side. The two differences is where Luke touched on the dark side, he was the one who also pulled back from it, whereas Anakin went full in, and that was it. So there is that thing where you think, even as you start to watch the battle in Death Star 2 in Jedi, Luke's starting to think more, whereas if that battle had taken place in A New Hope or in Empire Strikes Back, he would have just rushed in. He would have just rushed in and would have tried to take on the Emperor and would have ended up deaded. But by the time of Jedi, like you said, he's taken a step back and he's thinking about things a little bit more. Whereas, so he could possibly end up being clever enough to kind of maybe use Anakin's anger against him in the same way that really Obi-Wan did.
That's true. We don't know exactly what he's learnt in these 5 years since Jedi. Got Book of Boba Fett coming. That's probably going to delve into the past to a degree. They've said Rangers of the New Republic. I think there's opportunity, if they want to, for Luke to appear again. I'm curious to see where they take it, but it was just good to see Hamill so enthused.
Yes.
And clearly he's not done with Star Wars. This was a treat. It was a treat for him. For us, it was like, never thought we'd get this.
It was Christmas come early for us. But I suppose that's the thing also. It's that whole thing like now, in some respects, it's a positive moment. He's had a positive experience. So then potentially the door is now more wider than it maybe would have been just after Rise of Skywalker for Luke to return. So would you like to see him, like Luke, back in that time period? Would you like maybe even to see a whole series of Luke Skywalker shows on Disney Plus, or would you be content with him maybe just popping into, I don't know, the Ahsoka series? Or how much do you think they should use?
It is a touch of the less is more about Luke. In the same way, like we said earlier, talking about the villains of Star Wars, I don't think a Darth Vader series focusing purely on Vader would work. I don't think the tech would be up to doing a Luke series if they want to keep it as the face of Mark Hamill. We're not there yet.
No.
Not far off, but we're not there yet. But as in vignettes like this, I think, if Ahsoka overlaps and meets up with Luke, great. Rangers makes sense because, New Republic and Luke's obviously still very much affiliated with them, so that makes sense. There's lots of opportunities for overlap. Maybe even in Mandalorian Season 3, Mando and Luke had a very positive exchange at the end of Season 2. So there's no heat there. He willingly gives Grogu over. Luke promises to look after him and train him. There's a positive meeting there. So there's potential for Luke to appear in Mando Season 3. And clearly Book of Boba Fett. Boba Fett's now rocked up at Luke's home planet. So there's opportunities there. So I think it could sort of spring up in unexpected places, but I don't want that to happen too much. Partly because, like you say, it was a gift and it was a treat, and it was like, wow, we never thought we'd see that. If we get nothing else ever from Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker, and that's his final say on the matter, I think we'd all be satisfied, and so would he. But I don't think it is the final chapter of Hamill playing Luke now. I think that's back in play very nicely. So, like you said about Boba Fett coming back, he's always back on the table now. I think Luke's back on the table, but now we're getting a Fett series and he's front and centre. Thank goodness they're doing it. I don't think you'd do that with Luke. I think he'd pepper him in here and there. I think it would work great.
Hi, this is Gareth Edwards. director of the best standalone Star Wars film since Caravan of Courage, called Rogue One. You're listening to Panther Tracks. Enjoy.
So one final thing before we rock on out of episode 71 of Making Tracks. Sad news came in. Tom Kane has suffered a stroke, which has affected his speech. It affected his left side. He's on the mend. It's a slow process. I've got a close family member who's going through a similar situation at the moment, and she's battling through it, but it's tough. So we'd just like to say from the Making Tracks team and everybody at Fantha, just best wishes to Tom.
Yeah, get well soon. I mean, it must be devastating when you're a voice actor to be, to lose the ability to kind of communicate and to speak and all that. That pretty much takes away your livelihood, which is, I suppose then puts even more pressure on you to try and get better. So our thoughts and, all our positive vibes and good force energy is, directed at Tom right now.
Absolutely well said. Right, let's rock on out of here because we've got another episode to do next week and we need more Star Wars news, so we need to go out there and make it happen.
I will lead you into the outro like Malakiki leads a Rancor into a pit. So,
thanks for that.
That's all right. I'm not going to say who's the Rancor keeper and who's the Rancor. So I did say at the end of last year that we're going to make a New Year's resolution to get around to answer those questions. We had one plan to answer today, but we've rabbited too long again. We're going to move a listener's questions and we will get to them, I promise, to next week. But in the meantime, if you have any questions or comments or theories or speculations or any of the above, and you want to get in touch with us by the following ways. Mark.
Absolutely. Now, if you want to be a part of the action and stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news, visit fanthatracks.com or check out the free Panther Tracks app through the App Store to follow us on your mobile device. You can reach out to us and send in your listeners' questions by emailing radio@fanthatracks.com. Like Mark just said, we do have a few in the bag. We will get to them. We just talk too much. Comment, like and share on any of our social media feeds at Panther Tracks, and be sure to subscribe, leave a review, 5-star ones please, on Amazon Music, Audible, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcatcher or smart speaker of choice. And as always, thanks to James Semple for composing the Panther Tracks intro, Adam O'Brien for our Making Tracks opening music, and Mark Daniel and Vanessa Marshall for our voiceovers. Now, normally this is the bit where I would say you can watch and listen to Good Morning Tatooine, our weekly live news show on Sunday over at Panther Tracks Facebook, and then later on YouTube and on the site. But Brian decided to take a break this week. He's having a break off, so there's no Good Morning Tatooine this week. And I think that's about all of it. I can't think of anything else, and I've run out of breath.
Oh, well done. Okay, so whilst you were just reading all that out, I was just checking Facebook, and this has come up on my feed. This is one of those lovely memes, so I'm going to leave this one with you for the week. Quote a line from Star Wars, but replace one of the words with coffee.
Coffee?
Well,
I don't know.
Find out next week.
You stumped me. Yeah, I need a week to think of something. Thanks for that, Mark.
That's right. Everybody else, you take care. And if you got any ideas, send them in.
Coming up next on Fantha Tracks Radio, it's Cannon Fodder.